Welcome to the debut of Impact Portsmouth, presented by Wild Adventurous Life.
It's an honor to be here tonight, and it's especially an honor to be part of the first opening night for this Impact Speaker Series, and to celebrate with Jen and Emmy. That this is just really exciting. I've known Jen for a little while, and actually really from when this part of my story kind of started, because it was so beautifully introduced that our stories tend to find us, and if we're bold enough and wild enough and adventurous enough to walk through the pain and the hardship and the uncertainty and the fear and the excitement and the success, just staying awake to it all, good things do happen, wild things happen. And 13 years ago, I didn't think I would have a story to share with anybody. And really in the last 3.5 years, I took a yoga teacher training class, and for any yogis in the room, my hat's off to you, because for me, I didn't come out as a yoga teacher. I came out with a nice, expensive therapy bill, really, because that shit just cracked me open at a time when I needed to be cracked open. So I guess my story started, I guess, in sixth grade, really. So I often introduce myself first as a person in long-term recovery from alcohol and other drug, including heroin addiction. And for me, that means that I've been sober for almost 13 years. And by being active in my recovery, it's given me a life second to none, and a sober mom and a sober daughter. And I've been able to use the experience that I had because of addiction as a message of hope in a time when that message of hope has been really important, because we've all been touched and exposed to the devastation that's really happening out there. And so when I was 13 years old, my life didn't look from the outside any different than anybody else's. I grew up in a good family, Irish Catholic. That might be part of the problem. I love the line when people say, as Irish heritage, you can shake my family tree and Budweiser bottles fall out. That's probably the case. So, but for me, when I picked up my first drink, it put me on a pathway that it didn't put everybody on. And I was susceptible to the disease of substance use disorder or addiction or whatever you want to call it. And even before my first drink, by the time I was in sixth grade, so my problem's not with alcohol and drugs. That made everything that much worse. But when I was in sixth grade, so I was 13 years old. I have a sixth grader right now, and he's almost 12. So 13, 14 years old, I felt compelled to, as an adolescent, uncomfortable female, like many of us, I found diet pills and CVS, pharmacy, right over the counter. And then I found cigarettes. And the diet pills weren't because I was overweight or because I thought I needed to lose weight. It was because being uncomfortable in my skin felt kind of unbearable. And when I found substances, it just changed the way I felt. And it seemed fairly innocent. I found no-dos or something too, and would do homework at night or empty the dishwasher and feel like all jacked up, and it made emptying the dishwasher fun. But what happened for me was kind of this progression of harder drugs and alcoholic drinking and behavior and choices that were against my morals or against my values, hurt the people that loved me, and took away opportunities and the potential that I had for life, for living life. So I went through college. I had graduated high school. Actually, I get asked a lot, like, how does addiction happen? How could you prevent it? Like, why did it happen for you? Or how could we stop it from, having other people go down this path? I think part of the epidemic that we're seeing right now is very much from like trauma. And what my trauma looked like looks different for other people. And what I needed was a way to escape the things that I didn't know how to deal with, or escape the feelings of discomfort that I just didn't feel like I had the playbook for. And drugs and alcohol, and just kind of seeking outside of myself became what I thought was the solution. And eventually that search for a solution, or just changing the way I felt, started to change me, and I became physically, emotionally dependent on substances to just be able to go through life. And that left a spiritual void in me that was really just filled up by darkness. So when Jen and this evening was introduced as people willing to live vulnerably and boldly and adventurously, that's definitely been the case, because what happened through that time was stuff that 13 years ago, as a 26-year-old, and for the first time in my life, starting to walk a pathway committed to recovery and to sobriety, I thought that all of that stuff that had happened was I was ashamed of it. I was afraid of it, and I thought that it was best kept a secret from anybody else. So at the age of 26, I was a college graduate, thank God. And I had really been kicked out of my mom's house. This is kind of funny. So I thought it was a good idea. I went to high school in New Hampshire. I'm from out like the suburbs of Northeast Philadelphia, and this whole place up here was like culture shock. So at the end of my drinking and drugging, so how heroin started for me, right? Because I introduced myself as a heroin addict, or as a person in recovery from heroin, and I'm sure that's really intriguing to people. So how that story started for me, I was 18 years old. I had gone to Kearsarge High School out in like Sunapee area. And once I graduated, I wanted to get the crap out of here really quickly. So I went back to Philadelphia, which is where I was from. I went back to a summer of all of my friends graduating from high school and getting ready to go off to college. And there was a lot of partying, going into Philly to the clubs, a lot of fun. Like, it was fun. And one night after like going dancing, a couple guys showed up, one of my girlfriend's boyfriends, and we were all pretty lit. And somebody put down something, white powder on the table and said it was Ready Rock. It was crack. So Ready Rock sounded okay. Didn't sound like crack. I don't know, had I been told this is crack, I don't know if I would have done it. But at that point in the evening, my decision making was a little blurred anyway. So snorting a white line, and I wasn't alone in making that choice. And then, so as we were all kind of really amped up from just doing this Ready Rock, somebody introduced, what was it called? Smack. And it was more white powder, and snorted that. I wasn't putting a needle in my arm. I wasn't doing anything that had, that I learned in DARE or anything, right? And so that became another progression into driving down to Northeast Philadelphia. I had a white Volkswagen Cabriolet convertible with a Bob Marley sticker on the back and 3 flower petals on the bumper. And I had long blonde hair, and I would tie it up in a messy bun. And I was, adorable 19-year-old, had everything going for me, and I was driving down to Northeast Philadelphia, buying bags of heroin. And I proceeded to do that for about 8 months. Had a gun held to my head one night, just in places that I had no business being in places that my mom and my stepdad were at home watching TV, having pizza, never imagining that their daughter is doing these things. I remember one night getting high and going to South Street in Philadelphia, and we kind of tucked into this alley, and we just kind of did a little bump, and the feeling was quite euphoric. So when we all feel baffled by how people are making these decisions, drugs and alcohol serve a purpose, and they work for a lot of people. But what unfortunately happens is that the drugs that are out there now, the places that this stuff takes people, is death, and at least to a place of darkness that starts to feel like you can't get out of. And I sat there that night, and I remember looking down the alley and seeing people walking down back and forth South Street, enjoying the evening, shopping with their families, having a good time, and I just felt like I was completely missing out on life. And I didn't know how it got to that point. I eventually got arrested and was given a choice to do community service and go through some treatment and start to try and make better choices without having too much consequences. So that was definitely a wake-up call. So 13 years ago, I found myself back in New Hampshire. I had no place to go. My mom wouldn't take me back. I had burnt that bridge. And my dad lived in New Hampshire and said, you can come up here and stay with me, or you can come up here and I'll pick you up, and I'm taking you, you can't stay with me, I'm taking you to a treatment facility. So in March of, I'm so bad at numbers. So March of 2004, I came up to New Hampshire from Florida. And how I got to Florida, that was the funny part I was going to tell. So I was living in Richmond, and I was at the end, or I was had just graduated college. I was living with my mom because I couldn't afford to pay my rent anymore, and my roommate didn't want to take half of it and going to the bar Friday nights anymore. And it was just around Daytona Bike Week, so around March, I think. And I called my friend's dad from New Hampshire. I told him to pick me up off at a hotel off the side of 95 in Virginia. And I thought that I would go and find my prince on a shining Harley, and I would just go off on a different course. And that didn't happen. I ended up in Florida, and I could barely put a sentence together. And my options quickly became calling my parents to try and get it out, or doing like bikini car wash. So I called my dad. Ended up in New Hampshire with like a bathing suit and jean shorts and tank tops in March. He dropped me off at a treatment facility, and that became the first 4 months of my road to a sober life. So at that time, had you asked me would I have a story to tell or would I have a story to share, it didn't feel like it. I barely felt like I was going to be able to put my life back together to have any meaning. When I took away drugs and alcohol, it left me really uncomfortable with the past that I was bringing, and felt like I had to recover from. So that became a turning point for me when I decided to clench on to a sober life and clench on to whatever it would take to bring hope back into my heart and to bring fire back into my soul and to bring coherent thoughts back to my mind. I was 3 months sober, and I found out that I was pregnant. I was living in Bradford, New Hampshire with my father and my step siblings, and I thought, oh boy. It was actually the first time in my life that I felt so kind of out of control of my circumstances, yet knew in my heart that everything was going to be okay. And I proceeded forward doing everything that I was told, everything that I was guided towards, to live a life of physical, emotional, and spiritual wellness. And that, for me, meant excavating through a lot of shit, looking back at a lot of trauma that happened in my life, both in childhood and as a result of my drinking and drugging, and became willing and committed to grow from that, to heal from that, and to become stronger from that. I spent 9 years, so I had my son on just before my first year of sobriety, my anniversary, and I haven't picked up a drink or a drug since then, and he'll be 12 in June, and thank you. And when I found out I was pregnant, I also now became a partner to his father, and a stepmother to 3 of his kids. And I took that path with everything that I had. I loved all 4 of the kids equally. I was a partner to my husband. I participated in the things that helped keep me well. I needed to connect to a community, and I think that's what's so powerful about tonight, and what's happened for me in my life, especially over the last 3.5 years, is that I've been able to connect to communities of people. And through our community connectedness, through sharing our stories, through being vulnerable, we can change the world. And in a relatively short amount of time, and probably why I've been invited here, in the last 2.5 years, so it's interesting. I'm gonna jump track a little bit. In the last couple of months, I interviewed for a new job, and I went through a really extensive interview process. And in putting my resume together, and in doing that interview, it never crossed my mind to like put a list together of all of the places that I've spoken at and all of the people that I've spoken with. And yet, when I stopped for a moment and I looked back at that, I thought, the opportunities that I've had in the last 3 years are opportunities that not many people experience. Hillary Clinton invited me to speak with her at her first town hall in Keene, New Hampshire, during her kicking off her presidential campaign. That was pretty cool. I've spoke on NHPR a couple times. I have been on Rock 101 with Greg in the Morning Buzz a couple times now. I was an opening speaker at the Democratic presidential campaign debate at St. Anselm. Oh, this is kind of cool. So just a couple weeks ago, I went to Arkansas and I went to the Clinton Foundation. And regardless, I vote for people. I am, just politics I try to stay out of. And so, despite what your political beliefs are, there are people that have been influential in our country. And Bill Clinton is one of those for me. I think he was actually the first president I voted for. So I went down to the Clinton Foundation unexpectedly a couple weeks ago, and this is what living boldly also brings into your life, is just these crazy opportunities where all of a sudden you're in the flow and you're standing up and you're like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I say? And here I am. And this was one of those moments. So I had no idea how much Bill Clinton was going to have a presence at this thing. And it was a 4 or 5 hour event. I was asked to go last minute, and they were covering a whole range of topics, one of them being the opioid crisis. And I was sitting in the second row, and the panelists were 3 doctors, nobody with lived experience in addiction. And one was talking about vaccine for addiction. The other one was talking about medicating people because of this epidemic, and that's how we would fix this crisis. And another woman was from a state department somewhere. And I was sitting on my hands, just so agitated and frustrated with the conversation. Because for me, what recovery has looked like, it's looked like hope. It's looked like people participating in their lives. It's looks like people having opportunities in their community to live wild and adventurously, and to have supports available for them to help them live spiritually, emotionally, and physically well. And while I won't get into a debate, I will, but not right now. About medication, assisted recovery and treatment. I think that there's a time and place for medication, but I think that just about everybody can live a sober and free and phenomenal life. And if we don't give that enough of a chance, and if we let the conversation go towards medication, I think we're just going to continue to, put people asleep and turn off and really limit the opportunities of life that people have to live. So I was sitting there just painfully anxious about this conversation, and I kept thinking to myself, there's something more, and I was looking at Bill Clinton, and I thought, he's not, like, he needs more, like, this has to go bold. And I just kept getting that mantra, like, go big or go home. And I'm like, Sandi, you just started this new job, your boss is sitting next to you, don't do anything crazy. And then the other side of me is like, do it, like, let it go viral on YouTube or something. Do something so stupid that you'll at least be able to, like, you know, say something, because something needs to be said. And my hand is like creeping up my face, and I'm like, no. And all of a sudden, no joke, this is like the, you know, story choosing you. Bill Clinton turned around the first time in the entire event and said, does anybody want to raise their hand? And so I rose my hand and I stood up, and in front of, you know, a couple hundred people and Bill, Hill's husband, I stood up and I took the microphone and I said, my name's Sandi Coyle, and I'm a woman in long-term recovery, and what that means for me is I haven't had a drink or a drug in almost 13 years. And as a result of that, I've been able to be active in my community, give back a message of hope and recovery and opportunity for people that are still struggling. And I've found ways to help our communities heal and recover together, ways that work and ways that we need to all invest in. And for the first time in that morning's event, Bill Clinton put the microphone down, sat back, crossed his arms, and just smiled. And I'll fast forward. So after that, I went to talk to him a little bit, and he stood in front of me like this close, holding my hand, holding my shoulder, and he said, when you introduced yourself and started speaking, it was the first time I felt like I was back in the real world. He's like, you're right. If we don't give people an opportunity to go back to their communities, have social connectedness, have pathways to help them feel better about themselves and to get active in life, to show up as healthy parents, to show up as healthy employees, then you don't know Jack. And he poked me in the forehead. It was great. So my story came out really accidentally. A good friend of mine who's here tonight, Michael Venn, he's also the film producer of The Heroin Effect, which, if you haven't seen it, the first screening was at the Portsmouth Music Hall last month, and they're having a second screening on May 25th. Lights are, I can't see your numbers, 25th. And it's a documentary about a couple of people, or a lot of people's experience in recovery. And the first time when I went on to Greg in the Morning Buzz in December of 2014, Mike heard me that day. And that was the first time in public that on the sound airwaves, that I introduced myself as a person in recovery. And I got a Facebook message not long after from Mike, and he interviewed me for this documentary. And for the first time in 9 years, I shared my voice as a person in recovery. I broke the silence that I had been living for so long. And shortly after, a series of events happened, again, just that kind of delicate thread of life, you know, that when we're walking on it, it feels like a tightrope sometimes. And, you can put your seatbelt on and go for the ride, or you can throw your arms up and just scream. And so shortly after, an article came out on the Portsmouth Herald, and it said, ex-heroin addict plans recovery center. And for the first time in my sobriety, more than a handful of people were going to know it. I had girlfriends that didn't even know I was sober at that time. And after reading that article on the Seacoast Online, which I was getting ready to leave my office that day to go pick up my son from school, and I felt the stigma and the shame of this disease more alive than I ever had. And I went to pick up my son, and all of a sudden thought of myself as an ex-heroin addict. And the next morning I woke up, and the print ad on the paper had a headline called There's Hope. And when I saw that headline, I thought, that's my message. I've been given a chance and an opportunity to share a message of hope at a time when people need healing. And since sharing that message of hope, I've gotten to meet people who have lost their children. I've gotten to meet people that have 20 years of sobriety and are living amazing lives. And I got to become a part of a recovery movement that is not just happening here in New Hampshire, but it's happening across the globe. And there's a lot of people out there doing a lot of amazing things to get people the help they need. May 28th, or at the end of this month, will be a 1-year anniversary for the opening of Safe Harbor Recovery Center. If any of you haven't heard of it, it's just down the street on Islington. And that was my first stake in the ground of what recovery could look like. And at a time when the heroin epidemic started to rise and started to make itself known, I guess was really around the same time that I started to make myself known and to fight back against the epidemic and to hold a flag for hope and recovery. And since then have been able to see people's lives transform as a result of it, including mine. And it hasn't all felt great, but being willing to walk through the experiences, to hold people's hands when I'm scared, to share with people in the joy and the sorrow and the uncertainty, has opened up my life and has opened up opportunities for other people to get the help that they deserve and to live the wild and adventurous lives that are all out there waiting for us. So thanks for having me tonight.